Vintage watches, especially vintage Rolex watches, have become sought-after commodities. Extremely sought-after commodities. If we had to name some of the most common sports watches that are held in high regard, we would name the Submariner and its many references, the GMT and its references, the Daytona, pre-Newman, Newman, Zeniths, and the Explorer generations. But there is one watch in the Rolex family of vintage pieces that is barely ever spoken about. That, in part, is due to its rarity. Vintage Milgauss. 2 references. Again, like many times before, our attention needs to be turned back to the watch that started it all, the illustrious chronograph. Nobody, not even Rolex, knew what this watch was. Essentially an instrument that told the time, but also had a rotating bezel. There was no depth rating to it, no real specifications about the watch at all, and like most fairy tale endings, this piece contributed to some of the most successful watches in Rolex's long history. Soon after its introduction, the team at Rolex found good use in the bezel's properties for timing dives, and so the Submariner was born. Soon after that, the team found good use in the bezel's properties for plotting time zones, so the GMT was born. And in between that time, the team took the chronograph, slapped on an anti-magnetic Faraday cage over the movement, added a lightning bolt, and called it the Milgauss. And if you would like to see a more comprehensive discussion about the Milgauss, and where they stand as modern watches today, I will link it in the corner of the screen now. The reference 6541, probably one of the quirkiest vintage references that can be found today. And honestly, this watch really doesn't make any sense. From a design point of view, none of the elements correspond with each other. Portions of the dial are loomed, batons are pointed, the dial has a honeycomb texture. We have sharp elements, jagged elements, rounded elements, all vying for a position, and none of them go anywhere. It was such an oddball of the family. And bear in mind that, at the time, there was no clear establishment on what a sports watch was yet. This movement of creating slim-profiled steel watches was all the rave back then, and that is why we see such small models during that time period. Only after the watches were demanded to perform more and do more did we see innovations towards a greater focus of utility in sports pieces. The best way to sum it up would be to call it an experiment. The watch itself is the embodiment of an experiment, given to experimental physicists at CERN. When you look at it in that way, there is something quite special about it. I'm probably the first person in the world to ever associate a watch like this to Einstein, but this piece feels like something he would wear. In a way, I see his persona in this Milgauss, quirky and strange at times, but also committed and dedicated to science. What makes the watch more interesting than most is its use of color, especially red as highlights in different areas. Some models used red more than others. But the contrast of black and red gives this watch its iconic status, and as we will later see, it really paid off. As with most pieces from this time period, the proportions fascinate me. The thickness of the case, the length of the lugs, the overall width of the rivet bracelet, it always makes me question why mid-sized pieces like these aren't available nowadays. And in addition, it's amazing to see that a brand like Rolex was so daring with their decisions back then, and seeing how much it contrasts with its modern approach. So of the 3 watches that used the chronograph function, this one, the 6541, was the least successful. The design was only around for 4 years before production ended, but the seed had been planted. At least, the watch had an application. Maybe the design approach was too daring at the time. Maybe they weren't selling well. But what came from this watch? Oh, what came from this watch? A few years later, around the early 1960s, we were introduced to one of the most underrated icons in the entire Rolex family. A watch that very much was built on the same platform as the 1016 Explorer, but took the concept of the Milgauss and made it above and beyond elegant. The reference 1019. Here we see a watch that is all about refinement. I barely need to say anything about it. Just look at it. Clear, simple, concise. It has all the hallmarks of a design that should have remained the same up until today, in my opinion. And what makes it special is how it contrasts against the older reference. This model is all about sparsity, where the last was about excess in many ways. This is a fundamental aspect about design, and the 1019 is a clear example about what it means to reduce down to the bare minimum for the betterment of its performance. The initial impressions for most, it doesn't look like anything special, just a simple no-date watch. But drawing the attention closer to the dial, you start picking up on a few things. Highly polished batons on a matte black dial, very elegant, very formal in many ways. The hour and the minute hands are not your typical Mercedes hands. instead have an interesting form to them that line up very neatly to the elaborate minute track. This watch has to have one of the best looking minute tracks of any watch in the vintage sports family. Adding to that, we have a black seconds hand with a red highlight on the arrow tip. And the red highlights again, contrasting with the stark black dial. It is a seriously good looking watch. Simple and so elegant. So if the 6541 could be nicknamed the Einstein, I would nickname the 1019 as the Feynman. So we see these two pieces, how they are two generations apart and look like watches from completely different spectrums. They aren't even in the same building. The first, based around the format of a tool watch, it is more playful, more explorative, less defined. The second chose the format of using a typical oyster perpetual case and followed a more discreet approach. Now with the modern generations we are seeing, it is safe to say that the DNA of each has found its mark. A watch more based on formality, but still has that playful nature of the original Milgauss. Personally, I think the 1019 Milgauss was a watch well ahead of its time, and even to this day looks like a piece you could find on the shelves. It just goes to show that some of the least flamboyant watches have slipped under the radar. Both of these examples have different personalities. They are both seriously cool and highly collectible today, but they also add that uniqueness that we don't find with modern Rolex pieces. And it's well worth looking back to see just how experimentation shaped the way forward for these watches of the sciences.